Okay, I think as people are getting in, let's slowly get started. Welcome everybody to the session on climate change and the WASH sector, the first of a webinar series on climate and WASH, hosted by the European Microfinance Platform WASH Action Group. My name is Leandra Roller. I'm Climate Strategy Advisor to Aqua, and I'm joined today in presenting by Luz Nijkamp, Program Officer at Aqua, and Rachel Child, also Climate Strategy Advisor to Aqua. We have a very interesting program for you today. I'm pulling it up right here. I hope you can all see it. After an introduction, we'll go to a brief intro to Aqua, who are we? Then we'll talk about climate change and the WASH sector, have a look at climate, WASH and gender nexus. Then we'll hear about the impacts of climate change on financial institutions and on climate finance for WASH. We'll quickly talk about Aqua's climate commitment, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. But before we get started, we'd like to know a little bit more about you, our audience. So I'd like to invite you, open a browser or scan this QR code. If you open a browser, go to menti.com and enter the code that you see on this slide. Scan the QR code, open a browser, menti.com, and enter this code that you see here. Yay, thank you. And I would like, as a first question, you still see at the top of the screen, you can see the Menti code. What level of expertise would you say you have on WASH? What do we have in the room? This is the WASH Action Group. I'm very curious. Basic and intermediate. I'll give this a second. Let's see where people are standing. Okay, let's wait a little bit. Menti.com, I hope you can you still see the code at the top? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, okay, this isn't moving anymore. So I think we'll move to the next question, which is, what level of expertise would you say you have on climate change? Also basic, intermediate, are you advanced, or would you say you're even an expert already? Okay, see some basic knowledge, some intermediate knowledge. I think you're all right to the session. For those who still want to join, menti.com, the code is at the top of the screen. Also some advanced people. All right, thank you very much. As a next question, we would like to know, what kind of WASH products does your organization provide? This is a word cloud, so just type in whatever comes to your mind. What are you working on when it comes to WASH? This could be types of loans, types of programs. Yeah, I'm curious. Finance for WASH. Makes sense. What else do we have? Sanitation, evaluation, grants, funding. Anything more? Advisory. Very interesting. Maybe for people still joining, if you want to join this word cloud, give your input, go to menti.com and enter the code that you see on the top of this slide. Let us know, what are you working on with WASH? No product, no WASH product yet, I hope. Preparing metering, SATO pads. Hi, SATO people. Sanitation, solarized. Loans for septic tanks. We'll wait a little bit longer. Seems it's quite a variety of products people are working on. All right, I think I'm going to close this. Thank you. Oh no, things are coming. Well, thank you anyways. Last question before we dive into content. Have you already had wash products default as a result of climate change impacts? This could be a loan defaulting, or maybe even a program not working out. That could be a yes, a no, or with climate change, maybe it was something else. Let's wait a little bit to see what people have seen. I'd be curious to know why people don't know. Maybe you can write that into the chat. Okay, thank you all for participating and sharing. And I think this already gives us a good intro of we're really talking to the right people. There is a little bit of wash, a little bit of climate knowledge in here. We have a wide range of sector players, and we don't really know what climate change impacts on wash are. So with that, welcome to the session, and I'll hand it over to Luz for a short introduction to Aqua.
Yes, thank you, Leandra. Well, my name is Aqua. I'm a program manager, program officer at Aqua, and I'll just quickly introduce the organization to you. Please do also let me know if my internet is lagging a little bit, because I think it's not optimal at the moment. So if you could go to the next slide, Leandra. Aqua is an international foundation, and we operate primarily in Africa and Asia. And for over 2 decades now, we have worked towards catalyzing an innovative and sustainable and inclusive water and sanitation economy, because we believe that in order to reach SDG 6, so water and sanitation for all, it is important that we bridge that service gap, and then also there's also very much of a need to bridge the finance gap in water and sanitation. So our main focus is on supporting entrepreneurship. We believe that innovations and scalable solutions, bringing more, mobilizing more public and private capital into the sector, are key to be able to reach SDG 6. If you could go to the next slide, Leandra. That's a little bit of a making more clear what that means that we then do. We kind of work in 3 pillars, the first pillar, for example, is innovation, in which we really support entrepreneurs with in incubation stage, and then to reach the proof of concept stage. We also support entrepreneurs that are already at that proof of concept stage, and we help them to scale up to really replicate their idea and to reach more people. And then we also kind of, from the other side, we work together with financial institutions in order to mobilize more private capital into the sector. So that is a little short introduction of Aqua for All, and then I'm handing it back to you, I think, Leandra.
Indeed, we're doing a bit of jumping back and forth today between speakers. I'd like to talk a little bit about climate change and the wash sector. So a bit of background to this. Just so we're all on the same starting page, climate change refers to the long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. Now, of course, there is changes in weather patterns, and there is changes in local climates, and that have been happening for a long time. But over the recent decades, we've seen a bigger change in the global climate, and linked to an overall increase of global mean temperatures. We attribute this largely to the extraction and burning of fossil fuel like coal, oil, and gas for electricity generation, to fuel vehicles, and for industrial processes. We can also attribute it to deforestation and land use change because of removing of permanent vegetation. Vegetation stores carbon dioxide and absorbs it and puts it into the soil. So with removing of this vegetation, we have less storage and less sequestration. We can also attribute some of it to the decomposition of organic matter, producing methane. That could be from waste, such as landfills, or also from wastewater. How does this link to the water sector? Also, the water sector contributes to the emission of greenhouse gases from construction, from operation, or from decommissioning of projects. We estimate that there is a global 3 to 7% of greenhouse gases coming from the water sector. That's a bit of a span, and even that span is not quite solid, as especially sanitation emissions, and especially those from on-site sanitation. So think of pit latrines aren't that easy to quantify. Sources of emissions from the water sector include energy used for example, for pumping, so for operation of water and wastewater treatment systems. They also come from biochemical processes involved in the treatment of wastewater and water. And then again, from the methane emissions from untreated wastewater, from treating of wastewater from on-site sanitation, and lastly, also from eutrophication of water bodies. Eutrophication is when there is more algae growing in a water body. That is the result of excess nutrients, so surplus of nutrients coming from untreated sewage or from runoff from surfaces, getting into water bodies, leading to excess algae growth that then decomposes and again emits methane. Oh, there's an empty slide. Oh dear. Let me try to reshare this. Okay, I will quickly stop sharing and see what is going on here. Very strange.
Do you want me to try and share the slides from here?
I've got them again. Very strange. I don't know what's going on. Anyways, let's see. Can I see the slides again? Yeah? Okay, good. What are the impacts of climate change? IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, tells us that we see people's health, lives, and livelihoods already being impacted by climate change impacts such as heat wave storms, droughts, and flooding. We also see long onset changes such as sea level rise. On the graph below, you can see how increase of global warming levels of this overall global temperature impacts differently on continents and on water surfaces. So a warming of 2 degrees of the global mean temperature actually can result in a warming of 4 degrees on a continent. So that's something very important to keep in mind. Let's hope slides keep showing. Yes. So how does this impact of climate change affect the water sector in particular? We consider the water sector one of the most vulnerable to climate change, and that is because there is a very strong linkage between climate and weather and the water cycle. So if the air temperature gets warmer, warmer air is able to hold more moisture, which means that on the one side, we need more moisture in the air until it starts raining, which leads to these drought conditions. And at the same time, if there is more moisture in the air, if it does start raining, we get very heavy rainfalls, which then often lead to floods. So this is this link between water and climate, which is quite close, and this then impacts the water sector. So these droughts lead to an increased demand for water, so for drinking water consumption, but also for agriculture. So water service provider need to provide more water, due to drought conditions. The flooding that comes from heavy rainfall impacts dwellings, but also impacts wash infrastructure. And wash infrastructure is often found close to rivers and to lakes. So where water naturally comes, where flooding naturally occurs, is where we often find wash infrastructure. So we're a bit of in a critical situation here. Then we also have storms, cyclones, hurricanes that can damage wash infrastructure. And the rising temperatures also lead to an increased demand for water. At the same time, they also lead to an increase of waterborne diseases, because in warmer waters, pathogens like bacteria, viruses can grow more easily. And then lastly, we see climate change impacting the displacement of a lot of people, driving these people into urban centers, and thus putting more pressure on urban water infrastructure. Now, it sounds all quite horrible. So the question is, what do we do about it? And the international community has come together a number of times, and in 2015 has signed the Paris Agreement, in which we're trying to limit the emission of greenhouse gases. We call this mitigation, try to limit global warming to under 2, and we're trying very much to keep it below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. We're also looking into how can we adapt better to the impacts of climate change, which means how can we create resilience to these hazards that we talked about before. Paris Agreement also intends to make financial flows consistent with a pathway towards lower greenhouse gas emissions and towards climate resilient development, and we'll hear more about that later. And with that, I'd like to quickly hand over back to Luz to give us an input on climate watch and the gender nexus.
Yes, thank you. You can move to the next slide already. So we just quickly wanted to highlight a little bit of the impacts also on gender when it comes to climate and WASH. So the impact of climate change on the WASH sector, as I already explained, they have different implications for men and women. So climate change really highlights and exacerbates the gender inequalities that we already see within the WASH sector. And to understand a little bit of the impacts, I have highlighted 2 examples to make it very clear on how climate hazards impact also gender. So the first example is that due to climate change, we have more heat waves. So temperatures will rise and heat waves become more apparent. And as an effect, the amount of pathogens in the water will increase. And as an effect of that, the diseases in the water and then what people thus consume will increase as well. This will lead to more people being sick. And as women tend to take on more of the caring responsibilities within the family or within a community, this means that there is an increased care burden on these women. And as a second example, because of climate change, we will have more prolonged droughts. Then this will cause a reduction of the availability of water in the areas, and especially also those that are already dealing with water stress. And again, women often take on more of the role to fetch the water. They are usually the one responsible for water management within the household. And due to a lack of available water, women will need to, it will take more time to fetch the water. And on top of that, actually for women and girls, it becomes also, when they have to travel further, it usually also becomes more dangerous because they will just be more, well, when they have to go somewhere, they're usually already a little bit in danger of anyone who wants to do them harm, and this only becomes worse when they have to travel any further. If you could go to the next slide, Leandra. So yeah, that is the effect that climate change will have on women, but it's also important, like what can women can have a very strong impact if they are included in the decision-making process. So the studies have shown that to address the water-related problems and adapt to climate change, it is important that women, but also other marginalized groups are involved in the decision-making processes when it comes to water management, but also adapting to climate change. Because in many countries, women are responsible for water and have therefore also gained significant knowledge of the local ecological and water conditions, because they are just dealing with it on a daily basis. And this knowledge is insufficiently utilized within the professional water sector. Besides that, research has also shown that there's a strong correlation between the presence of women in management positions and the performance of this organization. And even the few studies that have taken place in the water sector, it shows similar results. And when women are involved in these decision-making processes, the projects or just the overall organization becomes more effective, more sustainable, but also there's higher attention for climate change and the community as a whole. And thus it is very important that women are included at every level of the decision-making process. And I have highlighted here the 2X Challenge framework on the right that shows the different levels of women to be included. And that also includes, for example, number 5, that investments, it also needs to be looked at. Women also need to be taken into account for that part. I think I'm handing over to Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Liz.
Yep. Thank you. So yeah, moving on to the impacts of climate change on financial institutions and climate finance for WASH. Next slide, please. So this diagram is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they did a lot of thinking about how you define climate or disaster risk. And they came to the conclusion it was a function of 3 different things. So first of all, it's of the weather and climate events that we've been thinking about. So we're talking about water scarcity, rising temperatures, also flooding and storms. We're also then thinking about the vulnerability of different sectors, so how they will be impacted by these climate hazards. So, for example, if we're thinking in the power sector, a solar PV project and a hydroelectric power plant, if we're thinking about a period of water scarcity, a solar PV plant can carry on operating pretty well, whereas a hydroelectric power plant, which is reliant on water, won't operate very well. And we've already heard from Leandra that we think the WASH sector is pretty vulnerable compared with other sectors. And then the third component is this idea of exposure. So this could be the people in the area or the infrastructure in the area, or for financial institutions, it could be the number of loans you've got in the area, right? And so all these 3 things together would come together to give this disaster risk or physical climate risk, we also increasingly refer to it as. So Aqua for All, we did quite a lot of thinking about this and looking at the enterprises that we support. And we came to the conclusion that they're in countries that are likely to experience extreme weather events, increasingly so going forward, and that the WASH sector is vulnerable to these extreme weather events. So we came to the conclusion, actually, a lot of the enterprises that we're supporting are facing high climate risk. Next slide, please. And we wanted then to think about what this means for Aqua for All, but also for financial institutions in general. So there was some really interesting work done by the Network for Greening of Financial Institutions, NGF Financial Systems, that's it, which is a group of central banks. And they did some work thinking about how climate risk can translate into financial risk. So we've adapted their work to make it more relevant to Aqua for All and the WASH sector. And so what we think is that WASH investments are likely to have high physical climate risk, as per the last slide, because of these climate hazards and because of this vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. And that this could mean then that income could be reduced and revenue could be reduced for a WASH enterprise, because if they're not working as well as they should, they probably get less revenue. They might have higher costs for maintenance and operation. So they might need to spend more money on repairs. And repairs might take a longer time. If there's sort of disruption to supply chains or roads aren't passable, then repairs will take longer, which will lead to even more loss of income. And then this in turn can lead to financial impacts. So loan defaults or lower than expected returns on equity or difficulties in refinancing. And increasingly we're seeing as well difficulties in finding insurance cover, or that insurance is becoming really expensive. I know of one fund manager operating in Africa, and they were trying to get insurance for a project from hailstones, and they just couldn't get it. So they had to take that risk and keep going. Also, I think for us, also important, as well as the financial impacts, are these non-financial impacts. Aqua for All is working very strongly around SDG 6, but if these WASH enterprises aren't working as we expected them to because of the impacts of climate change, then that's putting these non-financial goals around development impact and SDG 6 achievement, that's also going to be at risk. And just to finish off this slide, you'll notice maybe that I've missed the box on transition risk. That's another kind of climate risk, maybe less relevant for the wash sector, but that's around the transition to a low carbon economy, that maybe policies and pricing is changing. So if you've got an investment or an enterprise that you're working with that's very reliant on fossil fuel use, then they could also potentially be exposed to transition risk as the use of fossil fuels declines and policy changes. Next slide, please. So if we do an assessment of enterprises or organizations or infrastructure that we're supporting, and we find that they are exposed to climate risk, we think there's probably a high climate risk there, then obviously the next question is, well, what can you do about it? And there's been a lot of thinking around building resilience and how you can do that as part of support. And a lot of thinking is around sort of two different aspects of this, both of the infrastructure or the enterprise, but also through and the impacts on the local community. So at Aqua, what we've been thinking around is how we can increase the resilience of the wash infrastructure, so making infrastructure more flood proof, and then how we can increase resilience through wash infrastructure, for example, by having a water supply that's more resilient. And we've also been thinking quite a lot about the other side of this, right? Is there any risk that what we're doing could have a negative impact on resilience of local communities? It's not a wash example, but I heard a really good one a few weeks ago in the transport sector. And there was this road that was being rebuilt to be more resilient. And they put a load of drainage on the side of it. And it was great. When the rains came, the road was absolutely fine. Unfortunately, the drainage all went to the local town. And every time it rained, the road was fine, but the town was flooded. So that's an example of negative impact, which I guess we also need to think about as we're thinking about resilience. And then the idea comes around, well, people say, well, yes, this is all great, but resilience, if we're trying to increase it, it might increase costs, both initial capital costs, but also ongoing maintenance and operation costs. And I guess at Aqua, we've been again doing some thinking about this, and we came to two main conclusions. That the first one was that maybe it doesn't always increase costs. Maybe some thinking about resilience is maybe putting things in different places. If we know that there's a flood risk in a certain place, can we move the location to somewhere else? Or can we have a plan of what to do if there's some kind of climate hazard occurs? So maybe there are some measures that we think maybe won't cost so much. But then other measures that maybe do require higher costs, for example, in changes of building techniques. But there's been some research, and increasingly there's a lot of data coming out on this, that the extra expense you have at the beginning or on ongoing operations and maintenance costs is more than offset by reduced repair costs later on, or reduced disruptions to revenue. So thinking about how we can factor this into investment decisions is an ongoing piece of work. But overall, for example, the World Bank say that strengthening infrastructure is likely to be a robust investment, likely to be cost effective and generate benefits, and unlikely to generate, or cannot even generate, massive losses. Next slide, please. So for financial institutions, the climate disclosure frameworks like to talk a lot about risk, but they also mention whether there's potential new areas of business for financial institutions around managing climate risk. So we're thinking about new products and new target groups, for example, development of specific loan products to develop low carbon climate resilient wash. Whether there's opportunities to access new sources of finance. We know the MDBs, the DFIs, the private sector have all made commitments around investment in climate, or commitments to climate finance and investments in low carbon climate resilient solutions. And also these non-financial impacts in terms of making communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So thinking a bit more about climate finance, we did a bit of digging around to see what data there was around climate finance for WASH. So climate finance is a pretty broad term. It's finance aimed at reducing emissions, enhancing sinks, so more trees, and reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience. So the data, this is from the Climate Policy Initiative. They collected data on climate finance. The graph shows climate mitigation finance only, so that's finance to reduce emissions. You can see it's gone up. Currently climate finance doubled over the last decade, but it's still far, far short of where it needs to be in line with Paris Agreement goals. And we can see that most climate finance to date has been for renewable energy, the big red blob. A new sector, or the fastest growing sector, is low carbon transport, so electric vehicles. That's the blue blob. But then I don't know if you can sort of see down these sort of smaller sections. So the amount of climate finance for energy efficiency is much lower, for land use is much lower. And if you've got really good eyes, you'll see a very small beige line at the bottom, which is for water and waste. So there's not much climate mitigation finance for WASH. And we haven't got a graph, but adaptation and resilience, climate finance for adaptation and resilience is also a really small tranche of the overall amount of climate finance to date. Next slide, please. And so then we tried to find, we did find some data on climate finance for WASH in particular, and we noticed that most comes from DFIs and MDBs, very little from the private sector. And if you look at the bar chart on the left, you'll see that for WASH, whereas generally there's more climate finance for mitigation than for adaptation. For WASH, it's the other way around. There's more climate finance for adaptation than for mitigation. But still, given that we know climate finance as a whole is far short of where it needs to be, climate finance for WASH is far short of where it needs to be. So even though there is some, we know it's not where it needs to be. And then if we look at sort of basic WASH systems, the type of enterprises that Aqua for All supports, we see even of this small amount of finance that is available for WASH, for basic WASH systems, it's less than 10%, and that far more is allocated to bigger WASH projects or policy or water resources development. So we think we came to the conclusion there's probably a bit of a gap for climate finance for WASH, in particular for the type of WASH projects that Aqua for All invests in. Next slide, please. And we were trying to think about why this is and be very clear about what counts as climate finance, right? So the MDBs and the DFIs have defined what they count as climate finance, both from an adaptation and resilience perspective and also from a mitigation perspective. So from adaptation and resilience, there's that rather small and blurry diagram on the right, but that's the kind of chain of thinking that that needs to be done to identify an investment or an enterprise that you're supporting as eligible for climate finance. And it's around this identification of exposure to climate risks, so flooding, extreme heat, and then how you've included design elements to address those climate risks. So have you embedded resilience in some way? Have you changed the design? Have you thought about other things that can be used to reduce exposure to these climate risks? Have you thought about the impacts on the wider system? Is it improving resilience of the wider system? Is it making it worse, or have you addressed any potential to make it worse? And is it aligned with national plans and strategies? So this is the kind of thinking to allocate investments to climate finance from an adaptation resilience perspective. Next slide, please. From a mitigation perspective, it's around reducing emissions, so use of renewable energy or energy efficiency improvements, so solar water pumps, reduction in water leakages, reducing the need to boil water, so reducing the need for charcoal and wood and links to deforestation. And then the final category there is around reduction of methane emissions from anaerobic decomposition in wastewater. So if we change wastewater treatment practices to capture methane or to allow aerobic decomposition, that will also reduce emissions and can often align with climate finance criteria that way. Oh yeah, and I was trying to finish this section, I was trying to find some case studies. And as we saw before, there's not much climate finance for WASH, so it's quite difficult to find case studies. So this is the best I could do. The Green Climate Fund is this large international fund for funding climate change mitigation as well as adaptation and resilience. Their first private sector program in the WASH sector, their first investment was to Climate Investor 2 Fund, which is managed by climate fund managers at the Netherlands, I think. They made an investment of 145 million. One of the target sectors for this Climate Investor 2 Fund is the WASH sector. And one of the investments they made was in a technology company looking at solar-powered desalination units. So we can see that from a mitigation perspective, this is a good thing. It's solar PV likely displacing the use of fossil fuels. And it also has an impact on resilience of communities by providing a hopefully resilient source of water for them. So that kind of ticks both the mitigation box and the resilience and adaptation box. And the other case study is in Asia, it's in Indonesia. And this was a credit line from AFD to a state-owned enterprise in East Java in Indonesia. And this was an area that was increasingly facing water stress. There was sea level rise, there was decreasing rainfall. So the project was designed to tackle this water supply shortage and increased water stress by developing a treatment facility and reservoir, transmission network, pipes, and to supply water to up to 1.3 million people. And the AFD credit line funded about 25% of that. So this is an example where maybe there's not the mitigation elements, but there's a very strong adaptation and resilience element for a large number of people. I think, is that me? Excellent. And I think back to Luce. Or am I doing this?
No, I think Luce is doing it.
Yes, that's me. We can move to the next slide already. Just wanted to share a little bit on Aqua's climate change policy. So our vision is to ensure that the wash investments that we do are climate smart, which means that they are avoiding emissions, reducing risks, but are also building resilience. And in order to do that, we aim to mainstream the climate risk adaptation and mitigation impact assessments in all the initiatives that we support. Besides that, we will also support in the design and implementation of adaptation and mitigation measures where these are needed and where these are also possible, of course. And additionally, we will support financial institutions and investor partners in their climate risk assessment and mitigation screening in order to make their portfolio also more climate smart and help them invest sustainably. And lastly, but also not unimportantly, we also try to reduce our own operational footprint. If you go to the next slide, Leandra. Just wanted to highlight a little bit how Aqua also can support financial institutions in developing their climate smart wash portfolios. So Aqua can support in various ways. We can support in identifying and managing climate risks by identifying the climate risk in the location of investments, by reviewing the current portfolio in wash products and to identify any vulnerabilities to climate hazards there. And as a next step, then we can also advise on how to make these offer the wash products more climate resilient. Besides that, Aqua can also support in developing new smart wash products that are already aligned with climate finance taxonomies in order to also leverage that international climate finance that Rachel is also speaking about. And lastly, we can support in putting in place an NME system that tracks the improvements, of course, of the climate resilience of the wash products, and then also track the impact that it has on the beneficiaries of those products. Leandra.
Yeah, thank you, Luce. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you all for listening. I hope you're still with us. I'd like to not end this here, but check in with the audience again. Yeah, I hope you're still awake. We have a few more questions for you. So please open your browser, type in menti.com, or just scan this QR code here. If you go to menti.com, enter the code that you see at the bottom here to join the question session. Okay, menti.com, or scan the QR code. I hope we are all ready. Good. I'll go to the first question. You can still join. No, we have a screen. Oh no, we're good. Good. I was very scared the whole presentation that we're ending with the white screens again, but no, we're not. So if you still want to join the session, go to menti.com and enter the code at the top, the numbers there. And our question to you is, what capacity constraints do you face in providing climate smart wash products? I put some options here that could be maybe wash knowledge, mitigation, adaptation knowledge lacking, staff shortage to work on this. Maybe it's also liquidity or guarantees missing. Let us know. We're curious, where do we still have capacity constraints in the wash finance sector to provide more climate smart wash products? Okay, oh, this is updating slowly, I see. So it's mainly adaptation knowledge so far. Adaptation knowledge going stronger, then we have staff shortage, wash knowledge. And on place 6, there is mitigation knowledge. Okay, that's at least something. We'll some track with regards to mitigation. Adaptation was. Yeah, quick, wait a little bit more. If you still want to join this, go to menti.com and enter the code that you see at the top of the screen. All right, very interesting. Thank you for providing input here. Our next question is, who are the other stakeholders you're already working with on this topic, if any? So we'd like to know who else is working on this, who can we team up, who are you teaming up with? There's going to be a word cloud, so I'm curious to see what the WASH Finance Climate Inclusivity Network looks like. ICF. Okay. Who else is out there? I don't know, an institution called WASH, but if they are there, we'll check them out. Anybody else? Cooperatives, microfinance institutions, social enterprises. It's getting more colorful. Commercial banks. Anybody else working on this? Local authorities are very important. Is FSPs. Okay, thank you very much. I'll move to the next question, which is, after this session, which topics would you like to hear more about? Just to inform us, maybe also what weren't we elaborate enough on, what should we expand more in the next session like this, or what topic should we make a next session on? Curious to hear, what are we still missing? Or what was interesting, where do you think we should dive deeper? Let us know. Product design for FSPs. That's a good one. Case studies on mitigation measures at community level. Nice, I like it. Examples of an actual climate mitigation product undertaken by a financial institution. Actual examples, case studies of identifying climate risks, supporting climate resilience. I think we need to provide more case studies, Rachel. How SMEs have worked with climate resilience and benefited adaptation and mitigation initiatives that could prove profitable. How wash enterprises can access climate funds. Let's wait a little bit more. Can governments support with regulations? Indeed, they can. Okay, I want two more responses. Do two more people have something? What are you interested in? Lessons learned from FSPs, especially MFIs, which are successful in wash products. And one more, please. What do we have here? Wash climate finance for wash involving private sector financing loans. How to measure success of the projects? Okay, now they're coming. I think with that, I'll close this question still and head over to a Q&A. If you have any questions for the three of us, shoot them and we'll try to respond. I think it was very interesting to see I see in the chat and in the Q&A. So we try to, let's see if I can open these. Okay, I see there is a question from Lucia Stagliari. I hope that was correct. Thanks for the great presentation. What is your experience with the small size wash business segment? What is the bottleneck between good wash projects and good wash financing? That's a very good question. I don't know, Rachel, Luz, do you feel like answering?
It is a good question. There's 2 minutes to think. Are there any other questions in the meantime while we are thinking?
Yeah, this is okay. The second question is actually from the same person, which is probably redefining the question. What is the biggest bottleneck between finding good wash projects and finding good wash financing?
From a climate perspective, I think there's a bottleneck around identifying what wash projects count as climate financing and aligning to climate finance taxonomies. And that's from a very much a climate wash perspective. I don't know if Leandra and Luz, you wanted to add anything from a general wash perspective in Aqua for All's work.
Yeah, I'm sort of struggling with understanding the question, really. I don't know, Lucia, if you're in there. I don't know, can we unmute people? Probably not.
Thank you so much. This is Lucia. Thank you for the great presentation. I learned so much and it's fascinating. Apologies for the phrasing. So the idea is we all need to do more in this field. And so what is that we need the most and that we do not see enough? Is it good projects on the ground? So helping to address a need with a pathway to sustainability with resilience. And so is it on the side of the demand on the ground, or is the bottleneck more about, all right, projects are there, they're just waiting for the good, appropriate financing to be able to take off? I understand there is a segmentation aspect to this, because it is not the same, you know, to all the small size or large size projects, but I was curious about your experience in this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you for re-explaining. I think that made it clear. would say one of the challenges in the wash sector, and especially if we're talking about smaller scale and low income communities, is finding that line between affordability of prices and being a profitable business. And that links to having access to finance that can support an enterprise in setting that up. So we see that many finance institutions have not considered wash as a profitable business segment so far. So there is a bit of risk averseness when it comes to financing wash enterprises. Meaning it's difficult for people that want to set up a wash enterprise to access the right amount of finance. But, and I think that also became clear from the things that you said, what you'd like to learn about, I think there's also little examples out there on what works and what doesn't work. So yeah, I think on the one side, there is a bit of risk averseness from financial institutions. There is a little bit of not sufficient experience in providing wash lending. And then at the same time, it's a bit of a challenging business segment to work in. So I think we also just need more good showcases, possibly. And yeah, maybe also more people wanting to think outside the box and finding solutions. And I think, yeah, Rachel, you've unmuted. Do you want to add?
No, I was just thinking, and I think one of the areas that Aqua for All has been working in is sort of both sides of this, right? With the accelerator programs to do capacity building amongst wash enterprises on one hand, and then also capacity building with some selected financial institutions on the other hand, to look at how you could de-risk wash and make them investable, and how that links together. So as you said, Leandra, there's these two aspects. And then there's programs that Aqua for All is working on both to kind of address both these issues.
Yeah.
Great question, though.
Yeah, very, and I think very much to the point. Yeah, I hope that helped. Let us know if not. And then I see. Okay, good. I see another question from Juan Luis Podesta. Does financing wash products reduce affordability of MSMEs, the payment capacities for working capital financing? Or can repayments be offset by savings or other benefits? Struggling again with the question. Rachel.
Hanno, so are you able to unmute and explain a little bit more?
Hi, Rachel.
Hey.
Yeah, I've seen this in other green finance products that if a MSME entrepreneur wants to get working capital, they have a payment capacity. Say they want to finance $5,000, but if in parallel they have another loan, a green loan, or maybe wash product, they're going to pay a monthly payment, right? And then when the institution do for the daily capacity for the working capital loan, they're going to probably finance less than that $5,000 because the client needs to pay the other loan. You know what I mean? Then they might only give them like $4,000 or $3,000 because they need to pay the installments of the other loan.
Yeah, I think I understand. And I guess I'm not sure I have an answer. And I guess it's quite project specific. And I guess from a climate point of view, what we're increasingly looking at doing is building up this kind of evidence base around, is it more expensive to finance resilient wash products or resilient anything, right? And is that translating into savings later on? Because that's the theory and that's what the models say, but are we seeing that? And actually increasingly we are. I'm working with some other clients that are now starting to track loss of income due to climate impacts. And they've only been doing it for a little bit, so we haven't got good data yet. But I was looking at some data, not from the wash sector, but from the transport sector, of an organisation that had tracked how much extra they'd spent to make infrastructure resilient versus their savings. And they, after 10 years, had very, very clear data showing that the amount extra they'd spent had been, they'd made it back multiple times through having lower costs later on. So I think the evidence base is still being developed, but increasingly, I think as data is being collected, and that's something we're looking at very closely at Aqua for All, as we're starting to build in resilience and thinking about resilience into support for enterprises, what data can we collect to start to build up this evidence that the extra going in at the beginning is leading to savings later on? Not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And I think that the importance is not only to have the product, the wash product in the financial institution, but that the entrepreneur take up that loan. They use it and not have to choose between a working capital and a wash product that they can take over. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what you're hinting at is also there is sometimes also reluctance of taking up loans. And so yeah, it's again I think we need to connect lots of sector players and increase knowledge on all sides, and not as on general wash and finance, but then increasingly also on climate smart wash finance and inclusive wash finance and microfinance. And yeah, it's an interesting sector. Do we have other questions? If you'd like to just unmute yourself and ask a question, maybe we can still do one short one. If nobody is unmuting, then I think we're gonna slowly close this session. I thank you all for being here very much. I was very happy that you gave us some feedback on where you think we still need to work on, and I see there is especially a need for providing more examples and case studies, and I think that's extremely good to know. And let's start building evidence. Please do connect with us if you'd like to stay in touch, if you'd like to work with us. And otherwise, maybe we'll see you at the next webinar, and I'll wish you a pleasant day in the meantime. Thank you very much, and stop sharing and say goodbye.
Bye-bye.